G'day, great to be with you this morning. As I kick off, I'd like you just to finish this statement in your own mind. Notice what your instinctive reaction is and then maybe what it changes to. The question or the statement I've got for you is, I will feel fulfilled when? What was your response? A lot of times I reckon our statement goes to circumstances. So I will feel fulfilled when my kids go back to school, or when my kids come back to Christ, or I'll fulfill when my partner finally gets their act together and starts picking up dirty clothes off the bedroom floor, or whatever it is. Or I will feel fulfilled when I get that new 60-inch TV that I've been hanging out to watch finals on, or whatever. That sense of I will be fulfilled when is a great driver in our life. And I want to kind of talk a little bit around that this morning, because I think one of the things, Warwick mentioned it in the interview, is that during lockdown in particular, we tend to struggle with purpose a little bit. We tend to wrestle with our reason to get up in the morning. We just kind of drift from one thing to the next. I was talking to one of my neighbours yesterday, and she was saying she had no idea what day it was. So I told her the wrong day because I thought that'd be funny. We need a purpose and we need a reason. As a kid, we would go and visit an uncle and aunt of mine who lived on a farm outside Ballarat, a little place called Bungal. And Uncle Ernie had a sheep station up there, and we'd go for, 3 or 4 days or a week at a time or whatever. And I remember I used to love the big open spaces on the farm, and I used to love throwing things at sheep and all that sort of stuff. But one of the things I loved most was, after a storm had blown through, going out and chasing rainbows, running across the paddocks and just chasing the end of these rainbows. Until this week, I'd never really thought about why my parents put so much effort into selling me on the myth of the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Even now, I'm assuming the reason they did that was that they thought I was the only one in the family who stood a realistic chance of finding it, not because they were desperate for some peace and quiet after a period of rain. But it never occurred to me while I was chasing these pots of gold that it was an exercise in futility. I never realised that this thing was always going to be just out of reach, because I was far too busy finding ways to spend the pot of gold I thought that I was going to find. And I think we get a little bit like this sometimes. We get into a mode where we start to chase this thing at the end of the rainbow, this little thing that's just out of reach. And this morning, what we're going to do is we're going to watch as the teacher, as he calls himself, we think it's Solomon, as he heads across the fields of his own life in search of his own pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Steve introduced us last week to his quest, Solomon's quest for finding fulfillment by sinking his efforts into attaining wisdom. And he pursued this goal to the extent that he claims that he stood unrivaled compared to anyone else that had come before him in wisdom. Unfortunately, in his own estimation, this turned out to be something of a bust. So he goes on in his search to try something else. And he heads in a direction that many of us go off into when we're searching for fulfillment. He decides that seeing as wisdom is not the answer, he might as well try pleasure. And being the good student he is, the teacher doesn't go in half-baked. He throws himself into the pursuit of pleasure in any form that he could find it. There's a rabbinic tradition that the Song of Songs was written by Solomon in his youth. Proverbs was written in his prime, and then Eccelsiastes was written in his old age. And I don't know whether that's true or not, but it does give you a clue about the teacher's approach. It's like he's kept a diary of his search, and now he's reflecting back on it and its impact on his life. What we want to do is I want to read through some of the passage, and then we'll just look at the way the teacher searched for meaning. So in verse 2 of Ecclesiastes 2, he says this: "Laughter, I said, is madness. And what does pleasure accomplish? I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly, my mind still guiding me with wisdom. I wanted to see what was good for people to do under the heavens during the few days of their lives. I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself and planted vineyards. I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs to water groves of flourishing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had other slaves who were born in my house. I also owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. I amassed silver and gold for myself and the treasure of kings and provinces. I acquired male and female singers and a harem as well, the delights of a man's heart. I became greater by far than anyone in Jerusalem before me. In all this, my wisdom stayed with me. I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my labour, and this was the reward for all my toil. Solomon, in his search for fulfilment, he pursues fulfilment in three ways. He throws himself into life. He throws epic parties. He then finds that he needs something else, so he pursues epic projects, and then he tries to live the epic lifestyle, and we're going to have a quick look at some of those. So have a look at verse 3. It'll be on the screen. I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly, my mind still guiding me with wisdom. I wanted to see what was good for people to do under the heavens during the few days of their lives. This is Solomon saying, look, pursuing knowledge, pursuing all of that knowledge that I could possibly amass, that didn't do it for me. So I'm going to the other end of the spectrum. I'm going to throw a party, and I'm going to throw it hard. He decides that he's going to try and drink good wine, lots of good wine, and have lots of people over and not think about stuff and just have fun. Now, I want to give you a sense of the scale of what Solomon was doing. See, he was living on a scale that we struggle to picture. To give you a sense of what Solomon's house looks like, 1 Kings 4 gives us a picture of an average day's supply of food and drink. And it's quite frankly, it's astounding. This is what it says. It says the daily food requirements for Solomon's palace were 150 bushels of choice flour, 300 bushels of meal, which is about 600 kilos of grain. Also 10 oxen from the fattening pens, 20 pasture-fed cattle, because you've got to have the best Kobe beef, 100 sheep or goats, as well as deer, gazelle, roe deer, and choice poultry. Some translations say stuffed goose. That's a phenomenal amount of food. It's a really solid barbecue. I reckon that's what we're looking at here. It's estimated that Solomon was feeding something like 20,000 people a day. And then there's food and there's wine and all that sort of stuff on top of it. Solomon was living large. His days were a party. But the thing is, it didn't fill that emptiness inside. After time, it got old. And so he decided to head in a different direction. Verse 4 through 6, he says, I undertook great projects. This is in his search for fulfillment, his reason to get up. I built houses for myself and planted vineyards. I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs to water groves of flourishing trees. A little bit further on in 1 Kings 7, we get a list of some of Solomon's building projects. He built the house of the forest of Lebanon, the hall of pillars, and the hall of the throne, also called the hall of judgment, because he's king, you know. And that's just his office, right? He's gone on beyond that. He also built his own house, which took 14 years or so to build. He built an additional house for each wife, so that's about 700 wives, so that's like a suburb. 2 Chronicles 8 says he also built whole cities in the wilderness and fortified cities for his private army and collection of chariots. Like, his life was like the block, but on steroids. Right? The building projects, his thing for building, his obsession with building projects was insatiable, because he was looking to leave a mark, looking to leave something behind him that lasted. He gave his time to gardens as well. It wasn't all just about the house. Not just because he gave his time to gardens, not just because he wanted to see some roses grow, but because this was a mark of his brilliance as king. Any king worth his salt had to excel in handling the sword in one hand and the garden spade in the other. See, a garden, a luscious garden was not only a place of sensual pleasure, but it advanced the claim of the monarchy against raw nature, as well as symbolically furthering the king's claim over foreign territories. It wasn't uncommon for rulers of that time to boast of having cultivated certain botanical species from foreign lands they'd conquered. And they would claim that these transplants flourished better in their own gardens than in their native environments. Notice something else about all of this as well. Solomon's motivation. I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself. Right? This is Solomon, in a sense, at his most selfish. All this stuff he's doing is him chasing after a pot of gold that he wants to spend. Something that's just out of reach. In fact, it's one of the motifs of chapter 2. Look at the amount of times you see him say, I or myself. It's a very self-centered way of living. Now that he's built his own suburbs, now that he's gone through his building phase, he now needs to try and transition and to maintain the lifestyle that goes with that. So he throws himself into this epic lifestyle. He says, I bought male and female slaves and had other slaves who were born in my house. I also owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. I amassed silver and gold for myself and the treasure of kings and provinces. I acquired male and female singers and a harem as well, the delights of a man's heart. I became greater by far than anyone in Jerusalem before me. In all this, my wisdom stayed with me. Solomon gives his time to acquiring slaves, animals, wealth, and women. Now, for most of us, if we like a song, we might buy the album. If Solomon liked a song, he bought the band to play in his backyard, at his barbecue. He acquired everything his heart desired, and he held nothing back, because as king, he had no one to hold him back. He indulged every whim that crossed his mind, particularly sexually. 1 Kings 11 tells us this. It says, King Solomon loved many foreign women. I reckon that should be inverted commas. Besides Pharaoh's daughter, he married women from Moab, Ammon, Edom, Sidon, and from among the Hittites. The Lord had clearly instructed the people of Israel, you must not marry them because they'll turn your hearts to their gods. Yet Solomon insisted on loving them anyway. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines. And try and get your head around these numbers just for a minute. Like, for a start, my first thought is 700 wives. That means 700 mother-in-laws. A big hi to 80 who's watching at home, by the way. These women were not really valued. They were not really loved. The wives were there to keep political alliances. They were well-kept hostages, if you like. The thinking was that you're not going to attack a member of your own household in another palace. The concubines were there for sex. There's a guy, Ian Provan, who's a scholar who worked on the NIV application commentary, summing up Solomon's life. He said this. He said, Solomon's life is the life of many men in our culture. The carrying through of great projects, the building of personal monuments, the exertion of power over many other human beings, the amassing of wealth and the possession of many women. And what does it add up to? The chasing after the wind. Solomon's conclusion is that this was not just a misery-filled existence. He says, my heart took delight in all of my labour, and this was the reward for my toil. His conclusion is, some of this was nice and I enjoyed some of it, but when push comes to shove, it's pointless. It's a vapour. And we see this in the passage that we're looking at today, in 2 Kings 1 and then 2 Kings 12. He gives us his conclusion. He says, in 2 Kings 1, he says, I said to myself, come now, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good. But that also proved to be meaningless. In 2 Kings 12, it says, or he says, yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done, so the suburbs and the parties and the women and the slaves and the gold and everything else, all that I'd toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. nothing was gained under the sun. His musings continue, and it finishes on the cheery thought that whether you pursue wisdom or not, whether you're a fool or not, whether you build great monuments to yourself or not, we all meet the same end. The conclusion he draws is that all fun, all work, it all ends up in the same place, the grave, and that robs it of its meaning. What's the point of sinking your time into all these big projects or finding the perfect red wine or the ideal partner if you don't get to keep them? I think he would have resonated with that old cliche because it's true. He who dies with the most toys still dies. Here's the thing. There's no doubt that Solomon was a rich guy. If he was going to test the ability of pleasure to give life meaning, he had the means to do it properly. And he went at it flat stick. His conclusion is, frankly, pretty disappointing and a little bit disheartening for the way that we live today. If intelligence, good times, great projects, and following every desire that you have can't give a life any lasting purpose, what's left? Go back to that statement that I asked you to think about at the start of the message. I will feel fulfilled when. The book of Eccelsiastes was written about 3,000 years ago, so that's right about the time that this pandemic lockdown started. And yet, I think that the teacher's musings are remarkably relevant to us as Australians today, because we go searching in the same places. The thing that I've been rolling around in my head for the last week or so is Solomon any different to us? He's richer, but is he any different? See, his experiment feels very similar to the way a lot of Aussies live. I look back and I can see myself engaging in the same search in similar ways, maybe just not as extreme. And I don't reckon I'm Robinson Crusoe in that. As a nation, we tend to engage in our search for purpose in similar ways. How many of us live from weekend to weekend, if such a concept exists at the moment? This year, we have been hiding more and more in alcohol consumption. Alcohol purchasing is up by 28% over the same time last year. And this is for a nation who typically falls in the top 10 of alcohol drinkers in the world, depending on who you ask. Our houses have gotten bigger as we've taken on bigger projects and built bigger monuments to ourselves, even as our families have gotten smaller. Even our barbecues are getting more and more fancy as we go. I remember as a kid, the barbecue in our backyard was about 50 bricks and a metal hot plate. You put the wood underneath, you got the hot plate hot, and you burnt your food. During the week, I found an outdoor kitchen online, which was a bargain at $15,000. Now, I tried to talk Steph into buying it, but she wouldn't be in that. I'll keep trying. But it's not just projects, or it's not just things around the house. We're still searching for meaning in sex. Internet porn accounts for more data on the web than Netflix, Amazon, and Twitter combined. How many of us have convinced ourselves that we need to upgrade our TV or car or spouse in order to be truly happy in life? And we're programmed that way from a young age. TV tells us, you're miserable, you need this in order to be happy. And usually it's more of the same. And it's a chasing of the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. The teacher is telling us today that all this running after the next thing to try and buy happiness, it's like chasing the wind. Or to borrow a phrase from a theologian, a guy called Peter Kreeft, he says it's like engaging in a wild goose chase without the goose. All this search will bring is a desire for more. See, the search for pleasure, it holds out a promise that it can't fulfill. Pleasure fades, which means that if we need to always be happy, we're setting ourselves up for frustration because we always need to keep chasing that rush of pleasure. Now, in all of this, you need to hear what the teacher is not saying. Solomon is not saying avoid all pleasure and hunker down to a joyless existence and just bide your time until you die, alone, under the covers, in the dark. miserable. Right? In verse 10, go back to verse 10, Solomon says, my heart took delight in all my labour, and this was the reward for all of my toil. In other words, some of this stuff was good. I took pleasure in it. It was worthwhile, but it doesn't last. See, I think sometimes without really meaning to, we get it into our head that the true spiritual life means that we don't get to have any fun. That the world is a dark and dangerous place, and that any pleasure we find therein will lead to ruin spiritually. But that view, that perception, that thought process flies counter to the way that God has described his creation, and then the promise that God has given us about the life that we're given. If you go through the creation account at the beginning of Genesis, everything God says after each day, God saw and it was good. And after humanity was made, God saw and it was very good. And then he rested. In John 10, verse 9 and 10, Jesus tells us, yes, I am the gate. Those who come through me will be saved. They will come and go freely and will find good pastures. That doesn't sound too miserable to me. The thief's purpose is to steal, kill, and destroy. My purpose is to give them a rich and satisfying life. Other translations would say life to the full. That doesn't sound like a joyless existence living in a cave on a hillside waiting to die. So there's a tension we need to embrace when we talk about our approach to pleasure. If we go to either end of the spectrum, we tend to miss the kind of life that God would have us live. If we head to the it's all about me and my pleasure end of the spectrum, we create an idol for ourselves and we set ourselves up for frustration. If we go to the other end of the spectrum where we avoid anything that will even remotely bring us joy, we miss the life. The life to the full that Jesus promises. In other words, Solomon's example, and what we're saying today is that there is joy to be had in the things that we pursue. But when we look for those things to bring us a sense of lasting fulfillment, we're asking them to do something that they're incapable of doing. The things that bring us pleasure are temporary. And as the teacher says later in the book, we're created for something more. He says in Eccelsiastes 3:11, he says, yet God has made everything beautiful for its own time. He has planted eternity in the human heart. But even so, people cannot see the whole scope of God's work from the beginning to the end. We're created for something more than just temporary moments of pleasure. We get to enjoy them along the way, but we are created for more than that. God has created us with eternity in our hearts. And that's why we long to connect with something that's larger than ourselves. That's why we keep searching for meaning. We keep looking for something that will outlast the next fad or the next phase. Solomon's search is all about finding God, not in some discernible scheme of history or on some spiritual level suspended above the fray of human existence, but in the details and the grind of daily living. Julian of Norwich, who was a mystic, she put it this way. She said, this is the reason we have no ease of heart or soul. For we are seeking our rest in trivial things that cannot satisfy, and not seeking to know God Almighty, all wise, all good. He is true rest. It is his will that we should know him, and his pleasure that we should rest in him. Nothing less will satisfy us. I reckon she's hit the nail on the head. When we keep chasing that pot of gold, that thing that's just out of reach, we wear ourselves out and we rob ourselves of rest. It's in knowing God, it's in relationship with Jesus that we find true rest, because it's his yoke that's easy and his burden that's light. See, the message of Ecclesiastes, the message of Solomon to us this morning, isn't that all of life is meaningless and nothing matters. The message is, because God is the source of all meaning and goodness as we live the life we're given, everything matters. And I reckon that's Solomon's conclusion. He seems to say, look, brace yourself for the inevitable. But while there is still time, follow the deepest inclination of your heart, and revel in the glory of the ordinary. But be careful what you seek. I think if Jesus was having a conversation with him, he would have warned him, you know, where your treasure is, there your heart is also. Go back just for a minute to your answer to that statement from the start of the message. What was your gut response? Your first one, that first thing that popped into your head when I asked you what it needs for you, what it will take for you to be fulfilled. See, I think, and Warwick touched on it in the interview, if your answer wasn't connected to living out the purposes of God for your life, whatever that looks like, it would profit you to have a rethink. Not because God wants you to be miserable, but because your life has incredible meaning, but you'll never know that meaning until your life is found in the sovereign hand of God. So I want to encourage you this morning, even as lockdown keeps going and even as we keep waiting for the shackles to lift and all that sort of stuff, enjoy your life because it's a gift from God. I want to encourage you, don't live for your retirement, don't wait for tomorrow to be happy. Don't think that the new TV is going to bring you lasting happiness. Today is the day that the Lord has made, so we can rejoice and we can be glad in that and we can enjoy the blessing that today brings. Take time to do that. Take time to slow down and notice. The other thing I think I'd like to encourage you to do this morning, I think Jesus would remind us that rather than chasing the next thing, whatever that is, we need to seek first his kingdom and his righteousness. And then all these other things will be given to us as well. And when we find the kingdom first and then these other things later, in their proper perspective, we start experiencing the life to the full that Jesus means us to live. Don't live to find your meaning in work or money or pleasure or relationships. Don't live to find your meaning even in lockdown ending, which I'm hanging out for, by the way, because those things won't bring total fulfillment. They won't bring lasting fulfillment. They'll bring momentary pleasure. Instead, live for God, submitting all of these other things to his rule, and see how his goodness satisfies you. If you're longing to be satisfied by some event or some status being achieved or some purchase or whatever it is, it's time to reevaluate your priorities. See, whatever we live for that is apart from God or in contrast to God or prioritized over God will ultimately let us down. And I think that's what Solomon would say this morning. I think he'd say, surrender everything that you are to God. Trust everything that you are. Or trust him with everything that you are. Live for his glory and live for his purpose. And that's where fulfillment starts. That's where we find fulfillment in the first place. Why don't we take a moment to pray and then we'll worship and close our service. Heavenly Father, thank you that you're with us this morning. Thank you that you mean us to take joy in our daily lives. Thank you that you mean for us to find meaning and purpose, but those things are only found in you. Lord, this morning we turn to you and we ask for you to draw near to us. Help us find our reason, our meaning, our sense of fulfillment in you. And Lord, where we've been maybe chasing stuff that's not going to last, would you help us reorientate our lives around a pursuit of you and your kingdom? And then we'll give ourselves to you first. Father, thank you for meeting with us. Thank you that you love us so very, very much. And thank you for Solomon's example, even if it's a bit challenging to think about sometimes. Amen.